Hello class, welcome to our second lesson in section 6.2. This deals with trigonometric equations. We're going to go over another example dealing with 0 to 2 pi, and then we're going to look at some that have 0 to 360 degrees. So you want to make sure you have your calculator, make sure you know if your radians or degrees in the format. One thing I'll mention on these pieces is there's a lot of plugging in, so you want to make sure that your decimal points lined up in the right spot and you're rounding to the correct location in order to get the answers right. Okay, this first question has 2 cosine squared x equals root 3 cosine x. Anytime you see multiple pieces, move it over to one side and set it equal to 0. And then you want to factor out anything you can if it's just two terms like this. So I could take a cosine of x out. So that's cosine of x times 2x minus root 3. 2 cosine x, minus root 3. I set each of those equal to 0 like a factoring question, so cosine of x equals 0. We did a little bit of that idea with our previous lesson. Remember, cosine is 0 whenever the x value is 0, and that occurs at 90 and 270 on the unit circle, or in the cosine wave, you're looking at starting from above, hitting at 0, down, and back. Either of those ideas will work, but you should get 90 and 270, which is pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. The other one is 2 cosine x equals root 3. Solve it and set it equal to 0. Move the root 3 over to the other side, divide by 2. That means cosine is root 3 over 2. That corresponds to a reference angle of 30 degrees. And your two answers would be in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3 because of the all students take calculus, or the fact the x value has to be positive. And you should get pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6 because originally they were 30 and 330 in degrees. The next question is a factoring question, so you'll notice here that you have tangent squared minus 2 tangent minus 3 equals 0. So that's just your old-fashioned kind of foiling idea from algebra. Tangent times tangent would be tangent squared, negative 3 times 1 because it adds to negative 2. Those are your two pieces, and you set each of those equal to 0. Now the important thing about this scenario is that it's 0 to 360 degrees now, so you want to make sure your calculator's in degrees for these questions, and you'll just be using the tan inverse feature of your calculator. You'll have to pay attention to what it shows up as on your calculator to know what the answer is. Most likely what you need to figure out is what's the reference angle and what quadrants am I in to find my answer. So for example, tangent inverse of 3, you should have got 71.6. That's the answer in quadrant 1, and the second answer would be in quadrant 3 by taking 180 plus that reference angle. For tangent of x equals negative 1, depending on your calculator, it may give you a negative degree angle. It may give you 135. It should give you 135 as your answer for that situation. And then what you have to recognize is that's a 45 degree reference angle in quadrant 2. And the other answer has to be in quadrant 4 at 315. The reason those two work out nicely is tangent of negative 1 is from our reference triangles from 45, 45, 90. Okay, the next scenario we have to talk about is when it just has tangent squared. So you can move this 5 over if you wanted and try to do a factoring idea, but you're better off if there's only something squared, you're better off just square rooting it. So if I square root tan squared x, I get root 5 on the other side. The key though is it's plus or minus. Now the plus or minus is kind of good because you don't have to remember what quadrant you're in, because there's going to be 2 for the negative and 2 for the positive. So there's going to be 4 total answers as you're looking at that scenario. When you do tan inverse of root 5, you should get 65.9. That's the first answer and also the reference angle. So you find all the others. This one in quadrant 2 would be 180 minus that 65.9, 180 plus 65.9, 360 minus 65.9. But there should be 4 answers because there's 2 for the positive one and then 2 for the negative one. Okay, the next one should be the same idea. You could factor this one, it would work out, but if there's no middle term, if it's just sine squared, you're better off isolating the sine squared, I think. It'll be a little bit faster. So add the 1 to the other side, divide by 9, and then square root it. This ends up being plus or minus 1/3. And then to find the angle, you do sine inverse of 1/3, you'll get 19.5. Again, that's the answer in quadrant 1. There's 4 total answers, and you just go around the circle, 180 minus that number, 180 plus that number, and then 360 minus. To get all 4 answers that work around the circle. Okay, the next one, since this does have a middle term, there's a cosecant here by itself. You're better off just shifting everything over to one side and factoring. So for this scenario, cosecant times cosecant, and then minus 4 should be a plus 4 minus 1. And the reason for that is because this middle term is a plus 3. So you set each of those equal to 0. So cosecant x plus 4 equals 0. So cosecant of x is negative 4. Your calculator doesn't have a cosecant button, so you got to flip it and make it sine, and do sine inverse of negative 1/4. Okay, the key thing to this scenario is that if you do that, your calculator will probably spit out a negative angle because it's saying from 0 downward, it's negative 14.5. That's not in the interval that you care, 0 to 360, but it is the reference angle. So the reference angle, you can just basically ignore the negative sign and say, oh, well, my reference angle is 14.5 then. And then my two answers are in quadrants 3 and 4 because sine is negative in quadrants 3 and 4. And so my first answer is the 180 plus the number, and the second answer is 360 minus that number. And those two answers are in the interval from 0 to 360. Now that's only for the first group, so that's two answers for this group. And then I need to find the other two answers for this cosecant x minus 1. The trouble with this scenario is that means cosecant x equals 1, and sine of x would be its reciprocal, which is also 1. And when sine and cosine are 1 or negative 1, that's one of the few cases where you won't have two answers. You'll just have one answer to look at in that scenario. And the reason for that is because the two answers are really the same in itself. So this is at 90 degrees. You could do that from the sine graph like this. You could also say, well, when is the y value 1? Because sine would be y over r on the unit circle, and the y value is 1 up at 90 degrees. So this is one of the few cases where you end up with 3 answers instead of 4 on a question like this, and the main reason is because the sine of x equaling 1, cosine of x also could be that scenario. So, recapping a few things. You can use your calculator, obviously, to find the first answer, but you have to know how to find the second. Okay, so you're going to have to kind of work backwards and be able to find that in order to be successful on those questions. Have a good day, everyone.